Richard Heinberg. He's a senior fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute and author of several books on energy and the environment, including Afterburn, Society Beyond Fossil Fuels with David Friedley, and Renewable Future. He's won an award of excellence in energy education and has been published in Nature and the Wall Street Journal. Heinberg work is cited in one of the inspirations for international transition towns movement, which seeks to build community resilience at climate change. He and his wife, Janet, live in an energy-efficient permaculture home in Santa Rosa, California, and he's here with us today. Welcome, Richard.
Hi, good to be with you, Bunker. Okay, so I have a presentation that I would like to share, and let me just get that going. What I'd like to do is offer some historical context and background to hopefully help us understand this amazing moment that we're living in. And the frame I want to use is oil and power. Power is a word that, it's one of those words that we use a lot, and it has many definitions. So I think it's important to kind of tease those out to start with, because I'm going to be using the word in all of these senses. In physics, it's the rate of energy transfer, and we can measure power in the physical sense very precisely in terms of watts or horsepower. In nature, power is just the ability to do something. We talk about the power of flight that birds have, or the power of reproduction, or whatever. It's just the ability to do something. But then we human beings are very interested in social power, which comes in two brands: horizontal social power, which we've had ever since we were hunter-gatherers, the ability to do things together. But then there's vertical social power, vertical, one person being above another, which says basically do this or else, or if you do this, I'll give you something in return. So social power, the ability to get other people to do something, is something that's, it's not entirely unique to human beings. There are other social animals. But as a result of language and tool making, we've developed social power to extraordinary degrees. Physical power, we've also managed to increase pretty dramatically, especially in recent years, in two ways. One is through new energy sources. For millennia, our major energy source, other than the food we ate, was firewood. And then we gradually added water power. Wind power, actually, we've used for a long time too, in the form of sails for boats. But then everything changed really with the last couple of hundred years as we learned to access and burn fossil fuels, oil being the most important of the fossil fuels. The other innovations in physical power that are important to understand are tools to leverage energy transfer. And basically that's all the tools we use. Every technology is a way of leveraging energy to accomplish some task. But going back in history, things like wheels and levers and gears were really, really important ways of leveraging energy. So by doing these things, by using more energy sources outside of food, and by leveraging that energy, we've been able to accomplish a lot. We've been able to increase the amount of physical power that each human wields. And this is just a way of comparing. Here, the difference between a mouse at 0.8 watts, which is less than a small LED light, uses, all the way up to an elephant with 2.3 megawatts of power that it uses 24/7. A human, if we were just ordinary animals and we weren't using fire or any other energy sources, we'd be operating at about 100 watts. And a reasonably healthy human can apply about between 60 and 200 watts of power to do work in any given moment. Nobody can keep up 200 watts of effort continuously, but in a short burst, it's certainly possible. A hunter-gatherer with fire and some tools, maybe up to 500 watts. In a poor country, a modern industrial human, say India, something like 800 watts. But folks in North America are used to operating at about 10,000 watts, again, 24/7. So each of us is like a mega animal, each of us is from a power standpoint, the size of 4 elephants. In terms of social power, we've also had some innovations in history, one of which was money, which we invented when we developed early state societies, early cities with full-time division of labor. Money was an innovation then. Economists don't understand money very well. That seems like a strange thing to say, but it's certainly true. They think of money as just a medium of exchange, and that's really a very misleading way of thinking about money. Money is quantifiable, storable, and transferable social power. If you have money, you can get other people to do all kinds of things. And without money, in the world the way it is, you can't do very much at all. You have very little social power. Weapons are another source of social power. They control other people and other groups of people through fear. And then communication technologies. Remember, tools and language were the main advantages that enabled human beings to develop power in various ways. And if you put those two things together, language and tools, you get communication technologies. And so everything from writing, which was our first communication technology, to the printing press, to radio, television, and now these days, so many people are accustomed to using the word technology just to refer to social media and smartphones, ignoring 100,000, 200,000, maybe 1.5 million years of history in which we human beings developed all sorts of other technologies. So technology is useless without energy. And remember, tools or technologies are ways of leveraging energy. So if you have more energy to work with, you can do more stuff. We like to think that money makes the world go around, but it's actually energy. Without energy, money is meaningless. You can't do anything without energy. And what's happened over the last couple of 100 years as we accessed fossil fuels is we gained the ability to do all sorts of things that we couldn't do before. Of course, that entailed technological invention, inventing automobiles and airplanes and all the rest. But again, without the concentrated energy sources available, we wouldn't be flying airplanes on firewood. Just wouldn't work. So this is what recent history has looked like, a very, very steep increase in available energy and energy used for all the purposes of industry. The fossil fuels, of course, were already there. They've been there for millions of years. But it was science, engineering, and investment incentives, which we conveniently call capitalism, that really enabled us to access and use those fossil fuels. In fact, an industrial revolution almost got started in China about 1,000 years ago. The Chinese were using coal, burning it for heat and other simple purposes. And there was a lot of science and engineering going on in China at the same time. Inventions of all kinds, including the printing press and all sorts of things were being developed. The one thing the Chinese didn't have was government support for private investment, i.e. capitalism. And so as all of this new industry was flourishing, the government perceived this as a threat and basically shut it down. So instead of happening in China 1,000 years ago, the Industrial Revolution ended up happening in Europe and North America. And when it happened, it changed life for everybody. This graph, farm jobs as a percentage of total US jobs, you can see the dramatic shift from 90% of people being farmers in 1800, we go to 2% of the population working full-time in agriculture, 2.6% it says there today. And what this graph actually glosses over, I just grabbed it off the internet. It says farm jobs as a percentage of total US jobs. But of course, in 1800, 90% of people didn't have farm jobs. Nobody was paying them to go out and grow crops. They were all, independent producers. And the very idea of a job really barely even existed 2 centuries ago. And today, of course, just everybody who doesn't own their own little shop or business, most people work for somebody else, and we take it for granted that we need more jobs. Jobs are a good thing. Wow, what a strange way of organizing the world, and we've gotten used to it. So some things happened as a result of this process of reorganizing society, one of which was urbanization. Because we didn't need so many people on farms, what do those people do? Well, they moved to cities and looked for jobs. And so this created a couple of big problems that really came to a head during the 1930s. Overproduction and underemployment. Overproduction because with all this cheap energy and people working on assembly lines, it was possible to produce way more stuff than there was actual demand for. And so if supply exceeded demand, that meant there were fewer jobs, and you had a lot of people looking for jobs that weren't able to find them. So that was, we could talk for a long time about the causes of the Great Depression, but that's kind of it in a nutshell. And we found a solution. And when I say we, I mean basically the organizers of the economy found a solution to these problems, which was consumerism. Which was, we talk about consumerism sometimes as though it's just a perverse proclivity of modern industrial humans. We like to consume a lot of stuff. Well, why do we like to consume a lot of stuff? Because we're constantly, methodically encouraged to do so. It's a system. Consumerism is an economic system that encourages production and encourages consumption through advertising and consumer credit. Those are two of the big pillars of the consumer economy. And economics as a discipline, as a way of understanding the economy, was also growing up during this time. It barely even existed prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to our use of fossil fuels. So economists looked at what was happening, this unprecedented growth in energy, this reorganization of society with people moving from the countryside to cities and getting jobs and so on, they looked at this and they said, oh, this is normal. This is the way things are supposed to be, and it's the way things always will be. And as a result, economists baked some crazy ideas into their theories, into their assumptions. Again, this is just a picture I grabbed off the internet. This is the economy, producers and consumers. And we measure it by way of GDP, how much money is spent every year. And we assume that the purpose of the economy is to grow so that producers will always have more profits and consumers will always have more stuff and more jobs and therefore more money with which to buy more stuff. This little picture, of course, misses something, which is the earth, it's the natural world. Where does all this stuff come from? Does it just, appear out of thin air, or do we get it from other planets? No, of course we get it from the natural world, which is finite. All of our resources, whether they're renewable or non-renewable, including fossil fuels themselves, are finite. Renewable resources obviously regrow, but we can certainly extract and use them much faster than they can regrow, as we've been doing. So this is just one example of the craziness that's baked into current economic theory. As the economy was growing, so was inequality. And actually, this is a story that goes all the way back to early state societies with the development of agriculture itself. Early state societies were extremely unequal, kings and peasants. And throughout history, there have been moments of leveling the playing field so that those with more vertical social power were brought down to everybody else's level. And those tended to be moments of mass mobilization warfare. World War I and World War II during the 20th century were moments of great economic leveling because a lot of capital was destroyed and the government had to support the population in various ways so that everybody could participate in the war effort. Of course, revolutions, social collapse, and plagues have also been moments of economic leveling throughout world history. And you can see that happening also in the 20th century. In the 21st century, whether pandemic is ultimately going to be an economic leveler or the opposite is still an unfolding question. I don't think we've seen the end of that story yet. Other ways of leveling that have been developed for the most part in more recent times, the 20th century, are progressive taxation and redistributive social programs. And of course, those have emerged to greatly varying degrees at different times and in different countries as a way of minimizing economic inequality. Economic inequality is a problem, not just because it's unethical or immoral or whatever, which it certainly is. It's an affront to our humanity, but it also destabilizes societies. If wealth is extremely unequally distributed, people stop participating willingly in the projects that produce more wealth. It's the unfairness of it all just becomes unbearable. Okay, key components of the consumer economy. I've talked about this a little bit already, so I won't spend much time on it. Consumer credit is very important to understand as a pillar of the consumer economy. So we constantly have increasing amounts of debt, not just government debt. Everybody gets obsessed with government debt, but student loans, business debt, consumer credit, these are all have been all increasing pretty dramatically over the last few decades, along with new kinds of financial instruments and so on. This is how we keep this complicated ship afloat. But there's some very, very simple math that somehow economists don't understand, policymakers, politicians don't seem to understand. Exponential growth, which is what we've been experiencing over the last couple of centuries, is a phenomenon that systems theorists call self-reinforcing feedback. Population growth is also a kind of self-reinforcing feedback. If population grows, then you have more people to give birth to more children and so once the ball gets rolling, it tends to gather its own momentum. The same thing with economic growth. But this implies a doubling time. At just 1% growth, a quantity, any quantity will double in size in about 70 years, 1% per year, and it'll double in 70 years. At 2% growth, it doubles in size in 35 years, at 7% growth in 10 years, and so on. So when we hear that the economies, let's say China's economy has been growing at 7% per year over the last 20 years, that means the Chinese economy has doubled in size every 10 years. So after 20 years, the Chinese economy is 4 times the size it was at 20 years earlier, which means it's using 4 times as much energy, 4 times as much raw materials, etc. How long can you keep doing that on a finite planet? One of the implications of this is just since 1995, we've used about half of all the non-renewable resources that humanity has ever extracted and used in all of human history, just since 1995. So economic growth is something that everybody wants more of, and yet it's killing the planet, and it's by definition unsustainable. Well, this was understood back in 1972 by a team of scientists who used a simple computer program to produce a series of models suggesting pathways that might emerge over the course of the rest of the 20th century and the 21st century. And as they tweaked the computer program in various ways, it seemingly always showed a peak and decline in world economic activity sometime in the 21st century. Depending on the policies that they input into the computer program, that peak and decline could come earlier or it could come later. Also peak and decline in population, food per capita, and so on. This book, Limits to Growth, ended up being the best-selling environmental book of all time. And of course, it was attacked by mainstream economists. The idea that there were limits to growth, how could anybody say such a thing? And these poor people, Dana Meadows, Dennis Meadows, and the rest were attacked and continue to be. Dana Meadows is no longer with us, but Dennis Meadows is still around. And yeah, I mean, if you move in certain circles among mainstream economists and mention limits to growth, it's like, oh, well, that was demolished years ago. Of course, nobody believes that stuff. But it's based on simple common sense, and the computer model has been updated. We have much better input data, and you run that program today, and it comes out looking basically just the same. Meanwhile, population has grown we're getting pretty close to 8 billion right now. I still hear some people say 7 billion. You got to keep up with the times. And we don't know the future trajectory of human population. If it continues at current rates, we will exceed 12 billion this century, but there are very good reasons to assume that that's not going to happen. Fundamentally, we are overpowering the planet. Power is a good thing. Without power, we couldn't do anything. We wouldn't even be able to survive without the ability to do things. Power is good, but there can be too much of a good thing. And that's the essence of the human condition in the 21st century. We have so much power as a result of fossil fuels, as a result of our increased population, that we're overpowering the planet with pollution, with resource depletion, with destruction of habitat, with climate change. Fire is a good thing. Without fire, we humans would have much less control over our environment. There are all kinds of things we couldn't do. But if too much fire, again, is not such a good thing. Right now, everything that we do is associated with a little fire somewhere on the planet. Literally everything we do. I'm looking at my computer. It's built out of all kinds of non-renewable resources that were extracted with giant earth-moving machines. And in those earth-moving machines, there were diesel engines. And they were burning diesel fuel. That's a fairly small controlled fire. But there are literally billions and tens of billions of those little fires. And each of them is putting CO2 into the atmosphere, causing climate change, destabilizing the climate. I should mention the social power aspect of petroleum, of oil, because that's a fascinating story in itself. Of course, oil has generated enormous fortunes for the fossil fuel industry and the people who've invested in the fossil fuel industry. It's also created a really interesting geopolitical chessboard, because some countries have a lot of oil and some countries have a lot of oil and very few people even, and other countries have a lot of people and no oil. So international trade in fossil fuels, and especially oil is the most frequently, or I should say, oil is the fossil fuel that's traded in the largest quantities. Natural gas is traded across borders also, but not in as great quantities. The same thing with coal. So geopolitics during the 20th century came to be a lot about oil. The First and Second World Wars were not ostensibly fought over oil, but if you look at what was going on in the background, the Axis powers in World War II basically ran out of gasoline to fuel their war machinery. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union and North Africa in order to get fuel. And the Allies were able to choke off access to those sources. Meanwhile, the US was the world's largest oil exporter by far at that time, and was able to support the Allies, obviously with troops and soldiers, but much more so, much more importantly, with fuel. And so the Allies won the Second World War. A similar story with the First World War, actually. This book, Carbon Democracy, is really fascinating. If you're interested in the social power dynamics of fossil fuels, it's really the best work on the subject. Timothy Mitchell talks about how coal was very different from oil in that coal required a lot of people, a big workforce to extract it from the ground. And this was horrible work, coal mining. And so it was frequently choked off by strikes. And the labor movement really began in the coal mines in the 19th century in Britain and later other countries. And so a lot of the social, progressive social movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries really came from the social power that grew from the organizing around coal, but mostly in coal mining, but also in other related industries, the railroads and so on. But oil has a very different social power kind of profile, because it doesn't take so many people to get it out of the ground, and the work isn't quite so dreary, and it's a lot more profitable. So the oil era was not so supportive of democratic movements, and a lot of countries that are big oil producers are not very democratic. This is certainly true in the Middle East, Russia, and so on. So oil has, as I've been saying, is fossil fuels in general big problem for the climate, for creating these expectations of eternal economic growth and so on. We've obviously got to get off of oil and other fossil fuels because they're finite in quantity. We're extracting them in ever faster rates. So what are the alternatives? Well, there's nuclear power, but it's expensive. There are limits to uranium, and we're quickly reaching those limits. And there are unsolved waste and decommissioning issues. My team at Post-Carbon Institute does not think that nuclear power is a likely source of much more energy for industrial society. So that leaves solar and wind, renewable energy. And most of the mainstream environmental movements are promoting solar and wind power very assiduously. And we advocate solar and wind power too. However, we think they're being oversold in terms of their ability to maintain the kind of industrial consumer economy that we currently have. And I've written on this in this book here, Our Renewable Future, which is co-authored with David Fridley, who's on the energy analysis team at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. We did a year's deep dive into renewable energy and looking at it from all different standpoints. And our conclusion was that we certainly should be developing renewable energy, but there are these problems. One is that only 20% of the energy we currently use is in the form of electricity. And solar and wind produce electricity. Electricity is great. It's a very efficient carrier of energy, very versatile. But what about that other 80% of energy usage for which we currently use solid, liquid, and gaseous fuels, like for aviation or high heat industrial processes? We're going to have to switch out one way or another the great majority of our current industrial infrastructure in order to make the transition to solar and wind. So it's not just a matter of building a lot of solar panels and wind turbines. An enormous amount of other infrastructure is going to have to be replaced as well. Then there's the intermittency problem. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So we need obviously energy storage in the form of batteries, but that really only gets us through diurnal intermittency from one day to the next, day to night, and so on. What about seasonal intermittency? Or, what if you have 2 weeks with cloudy days and not much wind? Well, for that you need source redundancy. You just need to build a heck of a lot more solar panels and wind turbines than you're likely to need on a good day, and then connect them all with a supergrid. Well, again, that's going to be a lot of new infrastructure, a lot of new investment. And then there's the energy cost of the transition. We just talked about the need for enormous new infrastructure. I didn't even get into the possibility of using excess electricity on good days to create synthetic biofuel, or not biofuels, but synthetic fuels, whether it's ammonia or hydrogen or whatever to store energy and then to use for things like aviation. But that's another whole set of new infrastructure that would be required, perhaps as much infrastructure as the whole oil industry is today. So how do we build all that infrastructure in just a couple of decades, which is when we need to be finished with this? Well, the short answer is it's extremely unlikely that we can. So it makes sense to aim for a smaller scale of energy usage, smaller scale of infrastructure. That we probably can do, but from a policy standpoint, we don't know how to do that, because the only thing we know how to do from a policy standpoint is grow the economy. We don't know how to cut back on consumerism. And that's the one thing that would enable the energy transition to happen. What we need is post-growth economic thinking. And there are economists who have been thinking about this for some time. This is a picture of Herman Daly, who was the pioneer of steady state economics, or I prefer to call it post-growth economic thinking. And these are some of the ideas that post-growth economic thinkers have proposed for transitioning the economy beyond constant expansion. Our industrial food system is, of course, based on fossil fuels, and it creates all kinds of ecological problems. And most of you who are watching are already familiar with all of this, so I don't need to go into detail. So after oil, we're going to have to transition our food system. Actually, we need to start now in the process of transitioning our energy system. We need to simultaneously transition our food system back to small farms, everything regenerative, organic, and more labor intensive. The current pandemic, I believe, is the inflection point. We looked at the limits to growth graph earlier on. I think we're just about reaching those limits right now. And the pandemic, I think, is forcing the process. And currently, oil demand is down. Revenues to the oil industry are way down. The oil industry is drowning in debt. Oil production reached its all-time peak in November 2018, and I seriously doubt, under any circumstances, whether world oil production will ever surpass that level. I think we're in a new era right now, and so it's time to make other plans and get busy, because we don't have much time. So that's my presentation, and if there's time for a couple of questions, that would be great. Are you there, Bunker?
Yeah.
Do we have a couple of questions, or do you think we should just economize on time? Oh, okay. Here we go. We're all guilty. We're all connected. How then do we invite our oneness to the table? By creating an alternative example, of course, but macro level change requires shifts within power structure. Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. Our current power structure is sclerotic. It's unable to adapt. And frankly, I think the most likely scenario is a gradual or in the worst case, sudden collapse of our current power structures. And by that, I mean financial system and political system. And I think we're actually seeing that happen in real time. So that means doing as much as we can, as quickly as we can, to build horizontal power structures from the ground up. And that means local cooperative enterprises and power systems of all kinds. Get involved in your community, get involved in creating things like farmers markets and community supported agriculture. Those are level and distributed horizontal power structures, and we need more of them right now. What is the role of biofuels? How are experts? Biofuels have a limited role. If they're produced and used on the farm, they can be useful for running farm equipment. But on a large scale, biofuels are not an energy source. It typically takes more energy to produce them than they offer. And meanwhile, they result in more soil depletion or ruination and more deforestation, as it's happening with palm oil forests in much of Southeast Asia right now. So I'm not a big biofuels advocate, I have to say. Looks like we're ready for the next speaker. It's 10 o'clock. Well, I've appreciated the opportunity to share the last few minutes with you all. And I wish everyone a great conference and a survivable future. Good luck.